Hello, everyone. This is Dianne Smith with YogaUOnline, and I'm very happy to be here today with yoga teacher Dianne Bondy. Dianne is a social justice activist, an author, an accessible yoga teacher, and a leading figure in the Yoga for All movement. Dianne has an inclusive approach to yoga which empowers anyone to practice, regardless of their shape, size, ethnicity, or level of ability. And Dianne is one of the leading figures today in the movement to revolutionize yoga by educating yoga instructors around the world on how to make classes more welcoming and more safe for all kinds of practitioners. Dianne is the author of Yoga for Everyone, and she's a frequent contributor to leading yoga websites and yoga magazines. She has been featured in publications like The Guardian, Huffington Post, Cosmopolitan, and People. And Dianne, I should mention also that you are quite the Instagram star. So welcome. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you. Instagram is my not so guilty pleasure. I really enjoy connecting with people on the gram. That's like one of my favorite things to do.
Yeah. So tell us a bit about how you got started. Everyone today is talking about yoga for all or yoga for everybody. And I think there's a growing awareness in the yoga community that it's been too white, too skinny, and too exclusive of anyone who doesn't have, the standard yoga body. So I think there's a growing movement that really wants to see yoga teachers being able to teach to everybody. And I think for most people, that's a discussion that's come out within the last year or two, but you have really been doing this for a long time. So tell us how you got started with this.
A long time. I got started with yoga with my mom. I have a book on my shelf back there called Be Young with Yoga. And my mom I live in Canada, and my mother was a new immigrant to Canada with 3 children under the age of 4 and needed some way to manage her stress with no help, with no outside help, with no parents, with no grandparents, that kind of thing. And so she came to yoga as something to get a little bit of exercise and help her like breathe through the stressful moments of being a stay-at-home mom at the time in a very small rural town, which is now a thriving metropolis as things do change over time. And I've always practiced yoga. I recently turned 50 and I've been practicing yoga for most of my life since I was 3. And I kind of dipped in and out of yoga, from the beginning. It was kind of my primary way to get centered and get focused and spend time with my mom. And then over time it became an exercise kind of modality, some movement, a joyful movement practice for me. And then from there, it developed into a way of life when I started diving more deeply into the philosophy and applying it to my life as a woman of color, as a Black woman walking through the world. How can I start to lift some of, the veils or the layers that kept me from seeing what I was seeing or kept people like me out of yoga spaces. And I became I call it an accidental activist. I think a lot of people of color end up being activists because it's the only way I find in the current culture to validate our existence. It seems to me that as a person of color, as a Black person, you're constantly trying to validate why your existence is necessary and why your existence is actually helping the world thrive as a whole, and often get pushed back to the contrary. And one place I started to see an overrepresentation of able-bodied cisgender white women doing yoga was in yoga spaces. Like every yoga space I went to, I was often the only Black person, the only person of size, the only person of color, and was often dismissed by yoga teachers and the yoga industry at large. Large yoga publications did a good job of not featuring bodies of color, not featuring bodies of size, not featuring people from the LGBTQIA community, or people with non-conforming bodies, people with disabilities, people in plus size bodies, people in older bodies, right? We weren't seeing a whole lot of that represented. We were seeing a cultural norm of what European beauty looks like, and it was very model-esque in the way that it was being presented, and that's not the way I was taught. And so I decided to write a blog post for Elephant Journal at the time in 2011 or 2012, somewhere around there, saying that yoga, and the title is clickbait, that yoga isn't just for skinny white girls, was the name of the article title, because I wanted people to see that, you know, in my yoga spaces, I was seeing people of size, I was seeing people of color, I was seeing, you know, older adults, I was seeing people with everyday bodies walking through the world thinking that they didn't belong to a practice that is literally about connection and literally about unity. And I found that to be very problematic, and I started speaking out about it, and then people started asking me about it, and then I started connecting with other people who were feeling very marginalized by this practice that was supposed to be about unity. And I believe there was a study that was done either in 2012, another one done in 2016, looking at the demographics of yoga. And it was very evident to me and people who look like me and people in the circles, I like to call them yoga misfits, to the yoga misfits of the world, that we were not going to be center stage in this practice or in these wellness practices. And that's when I made it my mission to speak up and speak out and make it about all of us and just not some of us, and to start countering the over-representation of certain body types in yoga. And my friend and I, Melanie Klein, created the Yoga and Body Coalition, Yoga and Body Image Coalition in 2012, which started with a book around yoga, and it was a anthology of a lot of people talking about their own experiences of being marginalized within practice. And we're now on the third trilogy of the book, which is what has happened in the past 8 years. So there's been 3 books in 8 years talking about our progression and how we're putting out forward-facing images to, if you will, disrupt the narrative that only certain people belong in yoga and only certain kinds of bodies are yoga bodies. Right,
yeah. And I think you had like one defining experience that made you decide to become a teacher.
You know, I had always been in movement. So I've been teaching like fitness and movement classes since the 80s, since the late 80s. I'm dating myself. I already tell everybody how old I am, but and I had always kind of taught a stretch class. I never really was like trained as a yoga teacher, but I had fitness training and I knew how to stretch. So I just, you know, grabbed this book and we're doing stretches out of this book. And then I decided maybe I should go and get some training if I'm going to be teaching yoga. And that's how I kind of stepped into yoga teacher training in 2007. Actually, my yoga teacher is retiring in the next month or so and moving to Arizona. So she was like the first yoga teacher training that I took. I took a lot of like workshops here and there. I had a lot of education in fitness, but my first like 200 hours altogether one time teaching was in 2007. And I decided maybe I should get some training. I had already been teaching yoga now for, I don't know, 10 years. And I thought maybe I should get some training. And that's kind of how it started. And I was really lucky. I took my yoga teacher training. Michigan's like very close to me here, and Detroit is very close to me. I got to take my training in Detroit, and I got to sit in a class with a lot of different kinds of bodies. I took my teacher training with Kid Rock's brother, of all people, and he's a single amputee. He had an accident as a kid, and he was missing his right leg. So I got an opportunity right off the bat in yoga teacher training. And because I had been teaching for a while, I often got paired with him because I had some prior experience, some prior knowledge, and I got to really figure out how to look at yoga in a lot of different ways when people are missing limbs. And then that really transferred into working with as I like to say, nonconforming bodies, you know, people with disabilities, people who identify differently. And I wanted to make sure that we created a space that felt not only safe, but brave for people to come in and be exactly who they are.
Right. And how do you feel? You said you've been working on the trilogy for 8 years and you've really been working in this space for even longer.
Mm.
How do you feel things are changing? Is there sort of a growing awareness? Do you feel like you're making progress, that there is more receptivity to, I guess, more awareness around the issue?
Absolutely. So, it's funny, especially we talked a little bit about my Instagram love. It used to be when I scrolled through Instagram, when I first got on it, maybe 5 years ago, I would scroll through Instagram and not see anybody that looked like me practicing yoga. I would see a lot of what I call performative yoga, which is people doing all this complicated arm balances and asana and, doing things which I think are sometimes dangerous when I look at them, to put out there as, look at what I'm doing. I'm standing on a wheel while I'm doing tree, which I think is probably not a good idea. But I started to see that a lot, like see this, nobody that looked like me, nobody that looked like my students. And now when I scroll through Instagram, it is very diverse. We've seen the rise of people like Jessamine Stanley, who, who is not only a yogi in a large body, she's also queer, and an activist putting her stuff out there. 5 years ago, we weren't seeing things like that. Right. I remember 5 years ago when Running Magazine put Myrna Valerio, who's she's an ultra marathoner. When I say she runs like 50 miles, and she's a plus size runner. And when we saw her on the front of a magazine, we started to see the shift in, in wellness culture, and a shift in yoga culture. For some, I wouldn't say all publications jumped on, and the mainstream publication that we're all familiar with, who will remain nameless here, has yet to actually do anything beyond tokenizing, people of color. But I have seen it overall, where in spaces where we get to create our own narratives, which is why I am such a fan of social media, because I get to create my own platform, and I get to share the lens in which I see yoga in, and I don't have to wait to be validated by a publication or a company for my work. I can put my work out there, and people who it resonates with will find me, and that has been super powerful, because I've had so many people, at least 3 or 4 times a week, in my DMs, or I get an email saying, I never thought I could do yoga until I saw a picture of you doing yoga, and your body looked like my body. And it's representation is so important, because if you don't see people that look like you, then you don't think these things are for you. And that's really important to name.
Yeah. And I think, it's a frustration for a lot of yoga teachers that yoga teacher training prepares us so little for teaching diverse bodies. If you happen to be teaching the 20 to 35-year-old fit set, you're okay. But let's face it, it's actually a very, very small segment of the yoga student population that fits into that cubbyhole. And I think for most teachers, they end up teaching mixed level classes. And they have some that have like extreme skill levels, or at least have, good intermediate level. And then people who just, need different kind of variations of the poses to make it work. And I think there's been kind of a lack of yoga teaching methodology for how to teach to people with diverse bodies. So how have you developed that in your own practice? Have you self-taught yourself, or what has been your process?
Well, it's been a really interesting process. So I started out in a much larger body than I am now, and due to a health issue, my body has shifted and changed. I lost weight due to an illness I had. And so I've always been teaching in a plus size body. So I've always kind of had to figure it out for myself. But my 200-hour teacher training, having the opportunity to teach to Billy, that was his name, a person who was an amputee. I got that firsthand in my 200-hour teacher training, because he happened to be one of the students who showed up. So now we had to think outside of the box if we were going to be working with him. So that started the basis of me thinking, okay, if I can work with him and I can work in my own body, how can I start to unpack this? I started off in a basic 200-hour training, and then I went on to study Anusara Yoga, which spent a lot of time around body mechanics and a lot of time around anatomy and a lot of time around figuring out how bodies move. So I took all that knowledge and applied it. And then when I first opened my yoga studio, I don't have it anymore, but I had a yoga studio for 10 years. When I first opened my yoga studio, a woman approached me in a very large body and had said to me, can I book a private with you? I like Anusara Yoga. I like the theory behind it, and I want to practice with you. And so I thought, great. So I got for 5 years to work with somebody who had a lot of limitations in their body on a one-on-one 2-hour once a week practice that we did. And that was a game changer because I could see how her body moved. I could see how my body moved. I could start to see how my other students' bodies moved. And as a yoga teacher who didn't have a lot of money to hire a lot of teachers, I taught a lot of the classes. So it becomes, this necessity becomes learning on the job. And then shortly after Beth came to me, my friend Christina came to me, who is also, she's a yogi practicing with disabilities. She's in a chair. She doesn't have the use of her legs, and she has very limited use of her arms. And she sent me an email saying, I want to do yoga. Do you think a person like me can do yoga? And I was just like, of course, yoga is just breathing. And I figured if I could just sit with her and breathe with her, then I was doing yoga. But then I ended up figuring out through physiotherapy, through asking a physiotherapist, through asking a massage therapist, and figuring out how I could serve her, how to break down yoga for her body. And that became a great set of tools for applying to everyone else. And so that's how it's kind of evolved. I've had, for lack of a better word, the universe kind of give me opportunities to apply what I had learned in yoga teacher training. And I don't think if it wasn't for Anusara Yoga, the 200 yoga teacher training program was great because I happened to have a person in my class who had a missing limb. If he had not have been there, I probably would have been able to teach to other yoga teachers. And that's the problem with 200-hour teacher trainings. Right. The minimum requirement is that you have a year of practicing, right? So most people who are coming to the class are pretty able-bodied and already have a yoga practice. So you're basically teaching other teachers how to do yoga, which isn't really helpful. Yeah. So what was really helpful is at the time that I was in teacher training, I was already teaching yoga out in the world. So I would come back every week and say to my class, okay, this week in teacher training, this is what we learned, and let's apply it to bodies. And I was getting everybody. So it was really on the job training and learning and having opportunities for people to allow me to apply what I had learned on their bodies and them trusting me to keep them safe. So I had a lot of experience with working with a lot of different body types. And then I thought to myself, this is the big piece that's missing in all, if not all, 200-hour teacher trainings at the point when I was there.
Yeah. Is there one principle you can share that you feel is like what has really helped you the most? I know there's, many different
there's a lot
teaching methodology that come, but if you were to share one thing that really stands out for you in terms of making yoga work for anybody.
You know what it is? It's really simple. It's language, right? It's the way we frame our language around our bodies. Because I think if you are a woman, and I would even hesitate to use woman, but say everyone who lives in North America, we have been taught through fitness culture not to trust our bodies. We have been taught through fitness culture that fit people look a certain way. And we continue to perpetuate that through our language and the way we teach. I think what's been really helpful and one of the most, I think, broad ways that we can be more accessible and create brave and safer spaces for yoga is in the way that we talk to each other and the way we talk about our bodies. I think that was pivotal for me in creating language, like inviting people to explore or to allow people to be curious about what their body can do and letting go. The second thing I think what's been most influential for me is letting go of the idea that everybody has to look exactly the same. for me, what was really great and problematic at the same time about Anusara training is they had these universal principles of alignment that were supposed to apply to every single body. And as a person in a fat body, often these principles did not apply to me, but I didn't say anything because I didn't know. I just automatically assumed there was something wrong with my body and not something wrong with the principles, which is often what happens in yoga culture or fitness spaces, is that if I can't execute this pose in the most traditional, esoteric way that we see it presented in the world, then there's clearly something wrong with my body, as opposed to we need to adjust the pose to fit the body that you're in. That not everybody can fit into this one cookie cutter idea of like what triangle looks like. Triangle is going to look a number of different ways, whether we use the wall or a chair or blocks or we're kneeling or whatever it is. This idea that there's this here's the word that I don't like, or here's the expression that I don't like when I connect it back to language. When we say this is the most whatever, I'll put it in quotation marks, of the pose, the most advanced form of the pose, or this is the ideal form of the pose, or what have you. And then people who don't look like this picture that's been held up as this ideal begins to think that this is not for them. And that's super problematic.
Yeah. And I think that's a problem that for yoga teachers is also very difficult to deal with, because it's not just that yoga teachers tend to be trained in a specific version of the pose as the right one, but it's also that the students who come have an expectation, okay, well, this is what yoga should look like. And if yoga is not looking that way, I'm doing a lesser version.
Yeah, Sorry.
And so when you say working with languaging, because I've had, situations in our classes where you give an adjustment or a suggestion to someone and they don't want to do it because that's not what everyone else is doing.
Yeah.
So how do you work with people in that situation with languaging or sequencing, or what are some of the techniques you use for that?
I do both. I set expectations at the beginning of class, every class, all the time. So I sit down and I say to them, there is no full expression of the pose. That's the term I hate, or that's the full expression of the pose, because automatically you default into those perfectly generic, esoterical pictures of people doing asana, right? Postural asana, postural yoga. So I tell everybody that we are a myriad of bodies within this room, and everything's going to look different. Things are going to look different when I demo them. And it's really important, even though it's human nature, it's really important for us not to be looking around at everybody around us in a way that we're comparing ourselves. So there's a difference in looking around the room and going, what did she say? Where am I putting my hand, and look around to see what everybody else is doing, so because I missed the cue. And there's another thing entirely when we're looking at the most flexible person in the room with perfect body proportions executing this picturesque pose and thinking that we don't belong here. And I address that. Like, I set that expectation at the beginning of my class that everybody's going to look different. And I also teach in a way where there are places to work. So I usually give 1 or 2 or even 3 variations of the pose. And as the yoga teacher, if I'm going to demo it, take the most basic form of the pose, because I find those people who are advanced beginners or intermediate, or however you want to classify people who have, developed a physical practice that is maybe a lot more advanced than somebody who hasn't, will automatically go to the pose that they feel best in their body, or the most maybe advanced in their mind version of that pose, or maybe the traditional version of that pose, however we want to call it. And I let them find their own practice, because they practice before they know where they're going. I want to more focus on the people who are brand spanking new to the practice, who are going to be trying to reef themselves or force their bodies into a shape that's not going to work and that's going to injure them. So I really make sure that I'm modeling the most accessible version of the pose, because I'm not there to show off. I'm not there to show my, what I call genetic privilege, because there's a lot of us who come to this practice who are either dancers or skaters, or have a really good understanding of the physicality of our bodies, and could possibly do this practice with the traditional lens without really trying, because we have this body awareness, and then there's other people who do not. And I really want to focus on making them feel like their body is also okay, that there's nothing wrong with their body because it doesn't look like this. And that's when I set my expectations in the grounding and the centering at the beginning of class, that everybody is going to look different, and that's what we want. We don't all want to look the same. We don't all want to look the same in real life, in the world at large, and we certainly don't want that reflected in our yoga practice, right? That we're all able to share the energy, but it's going to look different for each of us.
Yeah, and I think the other reason this is such an important discussion is because it also shifts the focus from the asana to what's happening in the asana.
Yes.
Really kind of gets us to a point of, well, what ultimately is the purpose of yoga? Is it, looking good in a yoga pose, or is it the internal experience? And you had a really great phrase. You said earlier on, you said you were working on getting people curious about their body. So tell us a little bit about how you work on creating that yoga experience.
That curiosity.
Yeah.
I refrain from using the word exercise anywhere I can, because for me, exercise has a lot of negative connotations, and for a lot of people in the Western world, exercise equals weight loss, exercise equals I'm not good enough, exercise equals whatever, not trusting my body the way it is. Yeah. So what's really, really important for me is to have people experience the joy of movement in their body and be, like I said, be curious. So if we're doing, again, I default to triangle pose because it's my favorite pose. When we're doing triangle and I say, let's explore it on the wall, let's explore putting our foot against the wall. Let's explore leaning back into the wall. Let's explore bringing a block to the side. Let's not get into the idea. I remember hearing somebody cue that you're between two planes of glass. I'm like, we're never really between two planes of glass. And I already feel claustrophobic being wedged between two planes of glass. What if we just expanded it out a little bit and made room for our bodies to breathe and grow and move, and then observe what we're feeling in this moment, as opposed to looking for some kind of perfection. And so that's the cue I use. Let's be curious about what this feels like. So we're here, and let's be here. And if you're feeling stable and engaged and your breath is smooth, then your body's telling you, this is where I need to be and I love it. And if your body is not, if you're feeling like I want more, that's your curiosity, right? Like if you want to, maybe I add a block, or maybe I bring my fingers from the floor. So I always invite people to explore what comes up for them in a way that's not performative or pushing past what's available to them. So again, it's always about, setting expectations and letting people know that there's places to grow, that it's called a practice because we come back to it over and over and over again. And every time we come back to it, there's something new to learn. So if you learn it all in this class,
right.
So much.
Yeah, that's a beautiful point. And Dianne, we're really excited because you have a course coming up on YogaUOnline on teaching yoga to everybody, how to make yoga more inclusive. So tell us about what you will be covering.
Well, I'm really excited. All the things that I kind of spoke to today, which I love, languaging, how to teach progressively, giving people places to work, teaching people how to be curious, and then creating a practice where you get to explore, how would I move in this practice, by offering you opportunities to grow your own practice. I'm good, I'm here, I'm feeling strong and warrior. But what if I did this? And what if I did that? And I can always step back if it doesn't feel good. And I can always move forward if I'm curious about where I can go. So it's really about embracing diversity, inclusivity, and creating what I like to call brave spaces for people to explore and learn to trust their bodies, because that's been something that we've been taught over time, not to trust our bodies. So yoga can help us circle back to trusting our bodies and just being grateful and joyful in movement, and watching how you internalize that and how that changes the way you walk into the world.
That's beautiful. it sounds like it's really like what you're teaching is a process of empowerment, helping students reconnect with something that our culture, in a sense, has created a separation, which is,
Yeah.
you know, the
It,
body has to be like this and I'm not like that, so I'm
therefore I
not
don't
good enough.
belong, or therefore I'm not
Yeah,
good enough. And
right,
that's not true, right?
right,
And
right.
it's dispelling and unpacking
Mm-hmm,
those layers
mm-hmm,
that keep us from knowing the truth of who we are.
yeah,
And we can find that in the breath, and we can find that in the movement, and we can find that in connection to other people, to know that we're all on the mat for the same reasons. We don't think we are, right?
yeah,
But once we get there, we're there because we want to have a connection to something, I would think, bigger than ourselves. And we want to have an experience of being in our bodies that might not happen off the mat. But I always tell everybody that the mat, the 24 by 68-inch piece of rubber or plastic or whatever you're practicing on, is a microcosm of the greater world at large. So whatever we're learning on our mat
mm-hmm,
is transferable out into the bigger world. And what we need to learn in the bigger world, especially now, is that we all have a place and we all belong and we all get to contribute. So that has to happen in the yoga spaces as well.
beautiful. Well, Dianne, thank you so much for joining us today and for all the important work you're doing. I always am struck by the fact that we have 3,400 studies showing the benefits of yoga, and now more than 150 documented health benefits, or something over 100. And the great irony that so few yoga teachers know how to teach people who really need this practice to deal with those health issues.
Exactly.
So I don't think the work that you're doing can be underscored enough. It's just so significant to carve new ways to reach people and give them that beautiful experience of the inner aspect of yoga.
Mm-hmm.
So thank you so much for joining us, and we look very much forward to your course.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to share it. Thank you for the opportunity.
Take care. Namaste.
Namaste.